Good evening, everyone. It is presently 22:25 hours, or 10:25 p.m. on March 12th, 2024. Tonight we shall be reading Unintended Consequences, Part 2L. That's 2 Lima. Growth Continued. Tonight we shall be beginning at the start of Chapter 95, April Fools, dated April 1st, 1973. This chapter beginning corresponds to pages 286 of the ebook edition or page 332 of the hardcover edition. Regrettably, I don't have my softcover copy handy, but I'm pretty sure the page numbers correspond directly. Beginning now. This is Unintended Consequences, Part 2L, Growth Continued. Chapter 95, April Fools, April 1st, 1973. "Bill'll never let you back on the field if he finds out," George Govea said. "You'll have to jump at Turner Falls from now on." Henry Bowman noted with pleasure that George had not made some whiny comment about fearing for his own job at the parachuting school. It was one of the reasons that George was Henry's favorite employee at the Orange Sport Parachuting Center. "We've got to do it. It's April Fools, remember?" Henry said. "Look, we'll load up on the other side of the pumps. Bill won't see me taxi, and after that, there's no proof, right?" "I guess you're right. No one's going to believe a chick throwing a hissy fit." "Will the pilot go along with it?" Henry asked. George snorted. "You kidding me? He'd probably pay you to do it. He's got some other flying job lined up, and he's quitting in 2 weeks anyway." "Then it's a go, eh?" "Next jump run?" "Yeah, but we need a 5th person. We don't want Tom. He'd probably tell Stephanie, and you know how she is. Keith might try to feel me up. Rick's not here, so, Oh, we wouldn't want him. Lightning might strike twice," Henry warned with a laugh. "Oh, yeah, no shit," George replied, and broke up also. "Is Carl Beck here?" "Haven't seen him today. Jesus, wouldn't he be perfect, though?" Carl Beck was a cadaverous, one-eyed World War II vet. He had been shot to ribbons and left for dead in the European theater, and his sewn-up eye socket, tortuous limp, ruined jaw, and wispy hair made him look like an extra in a Boris Karloff movie. Carl had done the logical thing for a man who was completely disabled. He had taken up sport parachuting. In free fall, his disabilities vanished, and everyone on the airport liked jumping with Carl. He was a bit lackadaisical about packing his main chute, however, and the joke at Orange was that Carl Beck was the only man around who could qualify for a Class A license, which required 25 jumps on his reserve chute. Some years later, Carl would have his reserve chute fail as well, and he would land in a muddy drainage ditch at an estimated 85 miles per hour. After that, his limp became even worse, but he kept jumping. "What about Franny, then?" Henry asked. "She's here. Would she pitch a bitch?" "Hell no. Yeah, she'd be perfect. And Bill will believe her, if it comes to that." "Great," Henry said. "Here, give what's-his-name, the pilot. Give him my helmet to wear, and make sure he knows to go rich before start. And make damn sure that even if she freaks out, that girl doesn't pull inside the plane, okay? That would ruin everybody's day." Yeah, I can take care of that." "Good point. We'll stick her in the far back. I'll trim it up for best glide with no power before I go. And, George, since I won't be there to see it, milk it real good, okay? Act as if you're all snarled up and can't get out for a while before letting the pilot take over, huh?" "I gotta say, this is gonna be a good one, Harry," George Govea said with a big grin. Henry Bowman nodded and started walking towards the shack which served as the airport restaurant. Like most activities that could loosely be called thrill sports, sport parachuting in 1973 was an activity practiced primarily by young men. College students of both sexes drove up to Orange every weekend to make the first and only parachute jump of their lives just so they could say they did it. Very few women of that era, however, ever became experienced jumpers with instructors' ratings, or had jump logbooks with hundreds of entries. Those that did achieve such measures of proficiency, however, were accepted as equals. Fast Franny Stramenos was one of that group. Like almost all experienced jumpers, she liked a good gotcha, and more importantly, she felt no particular kinship to non-jumpers merely because they were of the same gender. That was important for what was about to happen. At Orange, as at every commercial drop zone in the country, an interested party could pay the same fee that the jumpers paid for their airlift and go on an observation flight. This meant that he or she got to ride in the plane with the parachutists, watch them jump out, and then land in the plane along with the pilot. Safety regulations required that in single-engine jump planes, all non-parachutists had to wear an emergency parachute in case of engine failure. Henry Bowman always thought this was a crazy rule. Jump planes stayed directly over whatever drop zone they serviced, and any pilot who had an engine failure directly over an airport and elected to abandon his aircraft did not deserve to have a pilot's license in the first place, at least in Henry's opinion. In spite of that, all drop zones around the country followed the rule. Pilots and observers in single-engine jump planes wore emergency parachutes. At almost every drop zone around the country, there was an equally important unwritten rule that the staff also followed. It took effect only when an exceptionally good-looking female signed up for an observation flight on a plane full of instructors and other experienced jumpers. The unwritten rule was that when the airplane got to jump altitude, the pilot pulled the throttle back to idle and told the observer that the engine had lost power and she was going to have to jump with the others. This practice had been going on almost as long as there had been sport jumpers and attractive female observers. Usually the woman would turn pale and occasionally screamed before the pilot opened the throttle and let her in on the joke. One young lady at Orange the year before had greatly endeared herself to the instructors. When given the news, she had nodded once in acceptance and then started to climb over the right seat of the Beech 18 to get to the door at the rear of the plane. The Beech was a twin, but the instructors had put a chute on her anyway, and the pilot had chopped both throttles. There were other good stories that the instructors liked to retell, but Henry's favorite was the legendary one that had occurred when the instructors had pulled the trick on a woman in a 10-person Nordøyen Norseman. The Orange facility owned 3 Norse Hogs, which were slow-flying 1940s-era military cargo aircraft, each powered by a single big radial engine. On the afternoon in question, the pilot gave the standard bad news to the observer, and then, as was custom, one of the instructors gave her the good news that it was just a joke. In this case, an instructor with the unlikely name of Rick Hustler had done the honors. What happened next varied according to who was telling the story and how much he'd had to drink. What was not disputed was that the young woman threw her arms around Rick Hustler's neck and said, "Oh, thank you, sir," or some other equally appropriate words of gratitude. The second thing that was never disputed was that when the plane passed over the exit point, Rick Hustler elected not to jump out of the aircraft with the rest of the jumpers, and actually landed in the plane with his new admirer. What transpired between the time the jumpers exited and the time the plane landed was cause for great speculation. But there was a third undisputed fact about the incident. Within a year, Rick Hustler and the young woman were husband and wife. Henry Bowman was about to elevate this standard drop zone prank into an art form. He didn't know it, but in so doing, he was also going to help the pilot get what he would later say was the best blowjob I ever had in my life. Since Henry did not know the man well, he would be unable to assess whether this was an impressive claim or not. Henry smiled as he bit into his hamburger. Henry thought the Orange Airport hamburgers were the best to be had in Massachusetts. When he saw through the restaurant window that the 4 people were standing around the Cessna 180 waiting for the pilot, Henry popped the last bite into his mouth and ran out the door. "Sorry I'm late." "Sorry for the wait." Henry apologized as he slowed to a walk in front of the group. No problem, Franny Stramenos said immediately. I was just telling Debbie here the most comfortable way to sit. She's never been cramped up in a plane with no seats before. All right, well, let's get in, said the man whose name Henry had forgotten. He was wearing a single emergency chute. I haven't made any jumps yet today. Henry and George bit their lips to keep from laughing. The Cessna 180 was set up as a jump aircraft, which meant it had all its seats removed save the one for the pilot, and would now hold 5 people instead of 4. A special jump door had been installed that hinged at the top and could be opened all the way in flight. The observer got in first and sat with her knees bunched up alongside the rear bulkhead. Fran Stramenos sat facing her, and George got in next. Then Henry climbed into the pilot's seat, and the other man sat on the floor where the passenger seat would normally have been, facing rearward. Henry Bowman quickly ran through the pre-flight checklist and started the engine. He taxied the plane immediately and kept his face turned to the left. He did not want the drop zone's owner to see that the man who was flying his jump aircraft was not the person he had hired to perform that job. The 180 was a tail-wheel airplane like Henry's acrobatic Cub, and its ground handling was similar, although the pedal effort was higher. Henry taxied to the end of the runway, did his engine run-up and magneto check, mumbled something unintelligible into the microphone, and pulled out onto the runway centerline. He pushed the throttle to full and held the yoke forward, keeping the plane straight with click stabs of the rudder pedals. As the tail came up, he eased the yoke back and let the airplane fly itself off the runway. Decent power for a spam can, he thought with a smile. Henry had a tube-and-rag pilot's disdain for all metal airplanes. Although modern equipment allows sport parachutists to glide to a landing virtually anywhere they choose, in 1973 many pilots had chutes of limited maneuverability, and the first high-performance gliding reserve chutes were still 6 years away. Thus, jumpers always strove to exit the aircraft at the proper point upwind of their intended landing spot, so that if they ended up having to deploy a non-steerable reserve chute, they would still end up somewhere on the airport and not in the woods. Normally, when a jump aircraft gets to jump altitude, this is accomplished by one of the jumpers opening the door, holding his head out so he can see straight down, and giving the pilot hand corrections to put him over a spot that has been pre-selected based on other jump runs or a test with a crepe paper streamer. On this flight, however, Henry Bowman was going to have to guess. It took Henry 17 minutes of circling the airport to get to an altitude of 7,500 feet above the ground. By that time, he had a good feel for the wind velocity and direction, and he turned the aircraft into the wind and flew directly over the big sand landing bowl that was in the center of the 3 runways. A quarter-mile past the parachutist's intended landing point, Henry Bowman trimmed the airplane a little nose up, pulled the mixture control to full lean, and brought the throttle back to idle position. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the jump pilot on the floor next to him draw his breath in sharply. In 4 seconds, the engine sputtered and stopped running. Henry had just fuel-starved it. The airplane was suddenly very quiet. "What's wrong?" Franny Stramenos yelled, her voice almost cracking. Nice touch, Franny, Henry Bowman thought with a smile. Perpetuate the stereotype, why don't we? "I don't know," Henry yelled back. "Bill warned me the jetting was off, but he said he couldn't afford to have the plane in the shop." Henry saw the pilot's face turn bright red as the man forced himself to contain his laughter. All the employees thought the airport owner was a tightwad. Henry put his right hand on the ignition key, looked at the man on the floor next to him, arched his eyebrows, and removed the key. A look of horrified comprehension came over the man's face, and he grabbed Henry's wrist. Henry slid the key back in the ignition, let go of it, and winked. "Just checking to see if you were paying attention." "Is the plane gonna crash?" The shapely woman in the back of the plane screamed as she strained to see what was going on. Henry turned around in the pilot's seat and made sure he had solid eye contact with the girl before he spoke. "Well, I'm sure as shit not going to stay in it and find out," he said in a loud voice. Then he reached across the real pilot's outstretched legs, unlatched the jump door, and swung it up against the wing. Henry stared in the girl's eyes once more. "See you on the ground," he said. Then Henry Bowman dove headfirst out of the aircraft. Henry bent slightly forward at the waist and bent his elbows so that he would fall in a back-to-earth position. He wanted to watch the airplane to see what would happen. Since the pilot had borrowed Henry's goggles as well as his helmet, Henry squinted so that his eyes wouldn't tear. It was a full 10 seconds before he saw a bright red jumpsuit appear. Well, there's Franny. He glanced at the altimeter on his chest strap, 6,300 feet. Henry watched the plane for another 10 count, but George didn't exit, so he flipped to a face-to-earth position, glanced at his altimeter, and got his bearings. 4,800 feet. Need to get over to the north edge of the farmer's field. Henry bent sideways at the waist to turn towards the field, then drew his arms in to his sides, cupped his hands forward, hunched his shoulders, and pointed his toes. He was now falling in a track, traveling almost 1 foot horizontally for every foot down. His speed through the air was over 200 miles per hour. At 3,000 feet, Henry was over the proper spot, and he spread his arms and legs out wide. It felt as if he had entered a thick layer of atmosphere, as his body slowed to about 130 miles per hour. At 2,400 feet, Henry pulled his ripcord and grabbed the nylon web risers that stretched out above his shoulders. He wanted to take some of the opening shock in his arms instead of entirely on the inside of his thighs. The rectangular parachute opened abruptly with a ripping noise, and Henry was slowed to a quiet and leisurely 9 miles an hour descent. The Ram Air inflated wing design had almost 30 miles per hour of forward speed, and Henry flew his parachute around the airport until he got within a few hundred feet of the ground. Then he aimed it upward and stalled it out when his shoes were a few feet off the ground in the middle of the sand bowl. He ran downwind and grabbed his chute before the wind could catch it and drag him. Then he looked up in the air. Franz Tremenos had opened high and was flying her Ram Air chute around the sky. George Govea had evidently pulled at the standard altitude of 2,500 feet. He was about 1,500 feet above the ground, hanging upside down in his harness. It was George's trademark. He had been a tumbler in school. George waited until he was 20 feet above the ground before flipping over and landing on his feet, then collapsed his chute and walked over to Henry. The two of them looked up in the sky. Franny did her terrified broad act and finally jumped out. I asked Dick if he wanted to jump before me. He said something about how he could see how scared the girl was, and he flew in a plane once, and he was going to try to restart the engine and see if he could land it because the observer was obviously panicked and he didn't want her to have to jump. I waited till he did a restart before I got out. So she still thinks her pilot has never landed a plane before? Henry demanded as he stared at the descending aircraft, which was now at 500 feet altitude on final approach. This is really great. Then he thought of something. Jesus, I hope she doesn't decide it's too risky and bail out about now. Wouldn't that be a bummer? The pair watched as the pilot brought the 180 in for a smooth landing. When it pulled onto the taxiway, Henry stuck out his hand and grinned. Happy April Fool's Day, George. Aye, that it is. That it is. New chapter here.